And the questions may still rise. So how can this path, the path of direct recognition, can be practiced? If A belongs to such an advanced level already, between no means to the means of pure grace, the means of Shiva, what is there to do? What is there left to do? Is there anything to do? So the first thing, to keep it clear that it's the way of life. It's not so much of a practice. It cannot be even called a methodology, although in itself it encompasses and leans on very similar methodologies that you can find in many other relative cousins of this great tradition. And the tradition of direct recognition, of course, is not exclusive to only this culture. You can find them in many cultures. But the elaborateness with which Tantra goes about it is quite astonishing. So the way of life, it's the philosophy of life. It will only make sense if this is literally applied as one's ideology, one's platform of understanding that reality is indeed non-dual, that reality itself is always perfect condition. Everything is in perfect equilibrium. And therefore one of the primal practices, when we speak about the practices now, once we understood that this is not a method or practice per se, it's the way of life. It's an adopted attitude, if you will. Philosophy, in a way, is always used as an adopted attitude towards life, one way or the other. We adopt that. Best is when we consciously choose philosophy. Second best is when we are introduced into it or born into it. And worse is when we are sucked into something which we have no consent over and simply become practicing ideology we never said yes to. It may fall under the different topic of a discourse, but it seems that our culture is very much in the current state when we are very often succumbed into a certain ideology, into a certain way of life, when it is simply imposed on us by virtue of its being a prevalently held ideation. And this is not even based on proper ideology, it's just a phony idea. Phony ideas put together give us this sense of we belong to some indeed great civilization, great culture that there is. But what we should not forget, in fact, that we are simply standing on the shoulders of great culture. And our culture is yet to become, to be honored with such term. In other words, we still need to be cultured enough to be called a culture. It's no wonder when Mahatma Gandhi was asked, if you remember this encounter, what does he think about Western civilization? He said, that will be a great idea. The confusion here is, of course, when we think of Western civilization, we somehow capitalize on all its glory of the past. We think if we sit in this amazing library with Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Parmenides and so forth, and Pythagoras and or later on, the Saint Francis of Assisi or the Saint Augustine of Aleppo. Somehow it gives us this sense that we're sitting indeed within that culture. But the only uninterrupted link in all cultures is that what truly unites us. But somehow, somewhere down the line, this notion of divide and conquer has entered our culture. This notion of divide and conquer, separate, somehow has become the underlying motive of our culture. A leitmotif, if you will. How and what, this is not the purpose of this discourse. So the philosophy of direct recognition here, it's an, I would say, one of the most profound perspectives on the nature of ultimate reality in terms of how it can be lived. It is to live life with constant reminder of its utter state of unity. And from that perspective, one's entire attitude towards life begins to gain different perspective and different dimension. So therefore, one of its practices is to work with 5 faces of Shiva, or to work with 5 aspects of awareness, to recognize them all to be complete, each in their own way. And as the next step, to recognize that everything we do, everything we think and feel, every experience, in other words, is a reflection of this 5-fold nature of oneness. One can trace and recognize that. And that recognition ideally should lead to the revelation, a deep insight of innate perfection of reality as it is. Because as soon as something feels as a calamity, as soon as something feels as a threat, if one is insightful enough, one will see this nothing other than transformative power that is already in operating mode. And these great forces are constantly at work. Therefore, this working with the 5 where that deep sense of acceptance of the totality of life as it is. What it does, of course, it creates this visceral possibility for not being pulled by the dichotomy of thought processes. Because the thought is dependent and at the mercy of that constant comparative analysis. And it likes to revel and strengthen itself in the right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth. Whereas when one sees that the whole entire creation is a manifestation of the Absolute in all its phases and in all its faces, one begins to recognize that this innate perfection is all there is. Even the state of being unsettled, any state of anxiety, one then is capable of recognizing as nothing other than the part and parcel of that perfection. So, among these practices, of course, it does not denying, and contrary to that, as have been mentioned earlier, the same perspective on the nature of great yoga is being recognized as indispensable. And that is exemplified in the supremacy of Shakti. Supremacy of Shakti in the sense that the Shakti that does the work here, that completes the transformation. So therefore, direct path or a gradual path, it has the same operating power, the power of awakened Shakti. Therefore, there cannot be any possibility for direct cognition unless the Shakti is enlivened, and that what creates that possibility for that cognition to take place. There is this unique perspective, of course, also, that Tantra is notorious for. Notorious also, we could even say infamous, is in its utterly unapologetic perspective on the Godhead, or on anything how divine manifests itself. This is what frightened the early colonists, and this is what made many to dismiss the profundity of this culture on the account of it being barbaric, or primitive. And it is to do with the attitude that somehow that what otherwise known as our benevolent God, that Western benevolent, always good, always looking after the affairs, always this patriarchal God. Instead, there are many different faces to the divine. So in other words, there is this benevolent, of course, merciful and so forth, beautiful, but there is also wrathful, terrifying aspects to the divine. Even when it is spoken in relation to the ultimate reality, even when it's spoken in relation to Shiva. As we know well that there are different names to Shiva. One of its more wrathful manifestations is that known as Bhairava. Bhairava, literally terrifying, wrathful. This unique perspective, of course, has been examined by psychologists of our time quite early on, to recognize how the institutionalized religions sanitized the image of God. Whether this happened for a purpose, whether this is just the outcome of history, but that division already exists in Christian heaven. The division on the benevolent idea, the benevolent notion of the Godhead, and this utterly perplexing, mind-bending notion of the evil, because we don't know where to place it. It somehow does not have place, so it would be placed somewhere at the gutter of the hell. Again, theologically speaking, many great mystics of Western culture, many great mystics of Christian civilization have been trying to solve this dilemma. We don't know exactly the degree and the measure of how much they have succeeded, because from the moment these works gained the patronage of the centralized church, all this work was closely scrutinized. And some great scholars of the early years of Christianity, like Thomas Aquinas, was known for his extraordinary and very deep, profound insights, but we also know that all his works, in order for them to gain public domain of the monastic life, would have to go through severe editings. Why are we saying this? Is that the notion of oneness, the notion of non-duality, is already jeopardized when God stands in opposition to something. If the notion of God stands in opposition to something, then this is duality. This is also what splits our psyche in half, because our psyche, our soul, is indeed always one with that, what that oneness represents. So you see that this is very important to understand. Our notion of the divine will either reconcile all the polarities in our psyche, or our notion of the divine will keep that subtle separation. And that subtle separation is precisely what religion, one way or the other, or religions, aim at. Because in a state of separation, one is bound to live in a state of guilt, in a state of that original sin at the root of creation. One's psyche then is the subject of endless manipulation. Yet the being for whom the divine is already reconciled all what there is, as it is impossible to control or rule in any way, because that's what freedom represents. Again, I'm kind of constantly veering off somewhere into the, not that I'm planning to start recruiting for the revolution going on, and these retreats have a specific purpose to see who are responsive enough to. It's primarily to bring our attention to this, how everything is already interconnected, and the subtlety of that. If our psyche is free of the split, then the recognition of oneness is all there is. It's natural. But the idea of that oneness has to contain it all already. It has to be true oneness. And in Vedic and Tantric spirituality, in these traditions, the notion of God is not the same as in many other cultures. God is transcending here absolutely everything. There are no qualities left. All qualities are irreconciled. All qualities are essentially transcended. There is no such thing as good or evil, but mind makes it so. Or as William said, there is no bad or good, but mind makes it so. Shakespeare was perhaps, if we are to believe, was quite an advanced being. When people have difficulty in reading scriptures, I say there's nothing wrong in reading Shakespeare. A drama of life is there, profound wisdom. So don't dump it into the river just yet. Was the message to some time ago when these ideas came. It's like, Sadhguru said, dump the books into the river. I said, hold on a minute, we have a library, don't just yet. Before you jump, bring the books here. So this therefore aspect, faces, and expressions of the Absolute that contains it all. And there is nothing in any realm of this creation that is not the expression of that Absolute. Therefore, any wrathful expression, any sorrow, any feeling, anything that we experience is made out of nothing other than aspects of awareness. It's made out of nothing other than archetypal qualities out of which this creation is made. This is tantric perspective. This, if you will, is yogic psychology.